Hello and welcome to this webinar launch of Patricia Gaborik's book, Mussolini's Theatre, Fascist Experiments in Art and Politics. My name is Emily Hockley and I'm the commissioning editor for theatre and literature at Cambridge University Press. We're really delighted to be celebrating the publication of the book today with Patricia, along with Mia Fuller, Roger Griffin and Jeffrey Schnapp. I have just a couple of housekeeping related points before we kick off. You've all joined in listen only mode, but you can, and we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the session using the Q&A box. We'll have a dedicated Q&A slot for 20 minutes or so towards the end, but keep the questions coming in throughout. A recording of the event will be emailed to everyone and also uploaded to YouTube after the event, so you can rewind and also let colleagues know if they've missed out. And we'll also send you a discount code to use on the book itself. If you have any tech problems, then do drop us a line again in the Q&A box and a member of our team will try and help you out. But to introduce Patricia, Patricia teaches at the University of Calabria and at the National Academy of Dramatic Arts in Italy. She has been a fellow in modern Italian studies at the American Academy in Rome and visiting scholar at Stanford, UCLA and Columbia University. She's also editing Pirandello in Context, which is forthcoming from Cambridge at the moment, and she is the editor-translator of Massimo Bontomelli's Watching the Moon and other plays. And Patricia will be in conversation today with Mia Fuller, who is Distinguished Associate Professor of Italian Studies and Chair of the Department of Italian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as Roger Griffin, who is Emeritus Professor in Modern History at Oxford Brookes University, and Jeffrey Schnapp, who is Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures and of Comparative Literature at Harvard University. The format today will consist of Mia, Roger and Jeffrey sharing their responses to the book, and we'll then hear from Patricia and we'll then have that time for audience questions at the end. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Mia.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you for asking me to do this. So I'm also the timekeeper, and if I keep glancing to the right, my right, it's because I'm watching the time. So I'm going to read some very quick notes that I've made, and this is my first read of the book, so this is my first response, and it has a lot to do with disciplines, disciplinarity, and I think the subsequent speakers will go much deeper in their directions. So the first thing that really strikes me is I thought a lot about representations as a word that's been with us cyclically in scholarship in a number of ways, but of course, when you get to theater, plus representations of Mussolini, which are usually a sort of standard topic, but in this case, it's also representations engineered by or sort of supervised from afar by Mussolini. And so I was just really thinking about that, and I was really struck by the fact that it was forbidden to represent him, quote, in the flesh, which is so interesting when you think about all the ways in which it was fine to represent him in 2 dimensions and 3 dimensions. So we have recent scholarship. I'm thinking of the books by Bertolini and Tola Swan, but they are standing on top of much other scholarship we've been really interested in these images of. So how would you define, or how did he define, you know, the difference between what was okay to represent and what was not? Very interesting to me was how much I learned about the ways in which to Mussolini, the theater was personal, right? Not just because he co-authored plays and chose to subsidize projects and he courted some theatrical geniuses, or he allowed himself to be courted by them. But you know, what really got my attention was in chapter 4 when he laments failure. And I thought, he really was a theater person. I mean, he sounded like a person in the theater. Oh, it's a complete failure. It's a complete failure. It's a disaster. But there's this blur, there's this fine line that the book comes to again and again that I'm really interested in, where, and this is actually the last of my notes, but I'll say it now. It's not entirely clear to me that Mussolini always really differentiated entirely between the craft and staging of theatrical work and the craft and staging of the state, or most especially the Italian populace. So in any case, as part of this, it becomes really possible to see him as believing profoundly, and those of us who study his materials often feel relatively cynical about this, but perhaps, at least in these materials, he seems to have genuinely believed in a national renewal and the efficacy of theater as a space and a tool that could actually make that happen. So speaking of liminality, Roger, you mentioned it a moment ago before we were with everybody else. But so the theater is a liminal space where a sort of anthropological rite of passage, a rite of initiation can take place. People are going to leave transformed. That's a really remarkable notion. So I'll go a little bit further with this, that he seems to have genuinely believed in the performativity, so not just in terms of performance, but the works of theater could actually affect change. And that really made me think about him believing in magic, which is just such a curious, really curious idea. But I will say, so considering how many works we have that are based on things he wrote and things people wrote about him, I felt like this opened up a new vista into, at times, what Mussolini actually felt and what he actually believed. And that's so interesting to me because most of the materials we ever read were self-conscious on his part. And so part of what's happened here is that you give us glimpses, right? For instance, when he says things to Claretta Petacci about his opinions of things. So then you suddenly feel like, wait, okay, so this is actually what he may have thought. So of course there's noise outside. I hope you can't hear it. I can't control it. So, but to go on with that. So I felt a little bit like many scholars, many writers of all stripes sort of look for what I think of as the meta of Mussolini, and here we actually get glimpses of it. I am referring in some ways quite specifically to the Scurati books, the recent M Part 1, Part 2, because those are so clearly built on excerpts from the press as well as Mussolini's own writings in particular. So, but this won't surprise you if I say, sorry, that's my timer, that you've managed to show us, not only that theater, which has been so often dismissed as marginal, is anything but marginal, because it actually gives us the story the many stories that you've put together show us very clearly how central it was to his formation, and I'm also very struck by, it gives us insight into his understanding of cultural capital in his day. And that seems to me, whereas we're used to thinking about political capital, right? His maneuvering, his various skills with brinkmanship, but this is something else. This really opens up something else. And so the last thing I'll say is, I very much appreciate strategic aestheticism, because it shows us something purposeful and not unpurposeful on Mussolini's part. Whereas very often, myself included, when we write, that all the arts were fostered under fascism, it has a sloppiness to it. And the last thing I'll say about that is it's interesting also to me specifically that if in 1934 he seems to be losing steam with respect to the theater, that's really when he picks up steam even more with architecture. So that's just also a thinking point. Anyway, I am done with my comments. Thank you very much. So now it's Jeffrey's turn. I'm going to bow to Jeffrey and turn on my timer again.
Thank you so much, Mia, and it's a pleasure to participate in this conversation. I'm going to pick up a couple of threads that Mia touched upon with regard to Patricia's Mussolini's theater, provide a couple of just framework reflections, and then pose a few questions that I would love to serve as kind of catalyst for some of the conversation that happens in the second half of this event. The first has to do with the kind of cultural historical conventions that have tended to dominate in the historiography of the first half of the 20th century. And one of the questions I think that Patricia's book calls attention to quite appropriately is something that certainly captured my curiosity when I first started thinking about this general topic of performance and the role of especially live performance in fascist politics, in the broadest possible sense, was indeed the absence of attention to the live and embodied theater. We have a way, I think, often of granting a kind of protagonist role to the technologies, the media technologies that emerge in the course of a period and then eventually triumph. And certainly in the 1920s and 30s in Italy, there was an acute sense of what was referred to as the crisis of the theater, the sense that audiences were somehow marching with their feet into cinemas and out of theaters. But the reality is that if you just look at the statistics, and Patricia's book demonstrates this amply, live embodied performance forms were by far the prevalent mode of the experience of spectacle during this period. And it's really only later, and perhaps in other national settings, that this absolute centrality of the cinema, which of course is one of the defining features of the media landscape of this period, that it really takes over and really reshapes all kinds of other cultural norms and patterns of engagement and participation. So this all just brings me to, I think, what for me is one of the really distinctive features of this book, which is, I think that it answers the question of what does theater history, or what does a theater historian bring to our understanding of the fascist decades that is a unique value added proposition. In other words, that pulls to the foreground something that otherwise is simply treated as one of many, many background elements. And I think the book makes a compelling case for the absolute centrality of the theater in so many different realms of public life in Italy during the Ventennio. Obviously, many of the skill sets and the kind of scholarly obligations that are essential to all forms of historical inquiry are shared across the disciplinary grid, whether it's, you know, patient and sustained digging in the archives, tracking correspondences and forms of conversation, speculating about inclusions as well as exclusions in the historical record, looking at the historical record itself as already an interpretation of the past, and of course, critical engagement with the work of prior scholars. But one of the things that Mussolini's theater does that significantly, I think, contributes to our understanding of the period is that Patricia actually reads the works that are at issue as works of the imagination, which is to say, you know, she doesn't just attend to the particulars of the work staging, and that's of course a crucial part of any theatrical work, but also to the way in which they are works of social fantasy, works of the imagination. And to probe them in a kind of deep, qualitative, interpretive, investigative sense is something that, unfortunately, I think is relatively rare in the histories of this period, where what has tended to be the case is for these works to essentially be reduced to documents among documents. They're pointed to, sometimes they're described, but they rarely are engaged with as works of fantasy, works of the imagination. And this dimension of social fantasy, I think, is particularly crucial in periods of revolutionary transformation, periods when, whether we're merely dealing with, you know, myths or fantasies, or we're dealing with actuality, new national imaginaries are being willfully designed, engineered, communicated, codified. And so I think it's precisely in that context that theater history brings a particularly rich lens to understand how, alongside all of those features of fascism, which are were once essentially treated as the essential features, the hard power aspects of the regime and its political practices, that soft power dimension is not a trivial dimension, but on the contrary, is often the driving force behind many of its institutional practices, reforms, commitments, investments, and so forth. And one example in the book that I think is a particularly rich example, and I don't envy Patricia in having carried out this task, was is the careful, reading, grappling with interpretations of Forzano, for example, who's a figure who in the history, histories of theater of the 20th century usually gets a few footnotes, even though he was by far the most popular figure in his time, had a long track record of successes. And there's many things that could be said about those inclusions and exclusions from standard theater history. But I think the payoff is clear in this book in the form of interpretations, engagements with the work that don't just essentially dismiss it on the basis of patronage decisions on the part of Mussolini, but actually try to investigate how it is that these works are not only cohesive expressions of a particular form of cultural practice, but also were successful in many cases, not just on the Italian stage, but they were successful on the international stage in other European countries, in other ideological contexts. And without an understanding of that facet of these works of the imagination, I think it's really hard to write a kind of rich textured history of this period. So I think one of the things I think that the book does that really adds to our understanding is precisely this grappling, not just from the outside with theater policy, theater practice, theater patronage, but also, as it were, from the inside. And one question that I have connected to this is your prior work, Patricia, on Bontempelli, of course, has dealt with some of the facets of Bontempelli's role as a theorist of the theater in this period, and certainly a theorist who not only was a practitioner, but also was politically engaged in a sense, trying to help Mussolini articulate a vision of new spectacle forms that were consonant with what he understood to be the fascist revolution. But Bontempelli plays a relatively secondary role in Mussolini's theater in this book, compared with, let's say, Pirandello, or with maybe even D'Annunzio, or with Forzano. And I guess one thing I'm curious about is to hear how or whether your own understanding of Bontempelli's role, however central as a kind of theorist, as a background figure he might be, has your reading of Bontempelli been shifted? In other words, by grappling with this broader sort of horizon within which his work operated. So that's sort of the first point I wanted to make. The second one is something that comes up repeatedly in the book in different contexts, from the political to the directorial in the sort of stricter theatrical sense. And that is the way in which certain political shifts, the centralization of cultural planning and patronage, is accompanied by the emergence of the director as this figure. The teatro di regia is the expression of this idea, but it's the director as auteur in a sense. You're sending me a signal, Mia? Is that minutes or? Okay. So one question I guess I'm interested in, having looked at Blasetti in particular at the helm of 18BL, this kind of great failure of an experiment with mass theater, is certainly Mussolini was very conscious of the kind of auteur model of directorship as being also a political model of leadership. I'm curious as to how much that ripples down and flows in the other direction, where we see concepts of the régisseur, kind of directorism bubbling up, bottom up, modeling itself after forms of political authority. In other words, a kind of bottom up complement to the top down. And I'll stop there and I have some other thoughts for the discussion after Roger presents.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Yes, and so Roger has slides. Roger? Are you muted?
Yeah, shows my Zoom incompetence. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you, Patricia, for writing this book. I appreciate the amount of work that's gone into it, and it's all part of what I experience as a massive velvet revolution that's occurred in fascist studies in general, and in Italian fascist studies in particular, which is ignorantly attributed to the cultural turn by Bosworth, but is actually part of a growing intelligence about the complex nature of fascism in all countries. So it did not set about to be a political revolution in a strict sense, sensu stricto, but it was actually a total cultural revolution. It was a totalitarian, that was a word that Mussolini was proud of. It was a totalizing revolution, very parallel to what the Bolsheviks in their first phase thought they were carrying out in Russia. And very interestingly, if you read a book such as Revolutionary Dreams by Stites, you can see the massive enthusiasm of the intelligentsia and the artistic elites of Tsarist Russia when the Russian Revolution took place, not because of the politics, but because of the prospect of being at the heart of culture and at the heart of the visionary need for direction, spiritual and literal, the direction that this new order was taking. And so I think there's been a velvet revolution in the understanding of totalitarianism, which for about four decades was dominated by Cold War ideas of a clash of titans, Tarzan versus Godzilla like, which completely eliminated the underlying rationales of both systems. So it's very nice to have this addition to the literature. Because I tend to, as you can see already, to ramble because of an academic disease called logorrhea, I have decided to put this in slide form, and I will stick to my own regimentation. Why I like this book. It endorses my fundamental argument in a number of articles, and notably in, of course, this is very narcissistic what I'm saying, in my book, Modernism and Fascism, that the theatre, like all the cultural initiatives under genuine fascism, under Mussolini and Hitler, but also in abortive fascist movements, such as those of the Falange, the BUF and the Iron Guard, and I can give you the literature on all this, even those which were apparently reactionary or anti-modernist in style or aesthetic, were conceived as integral to the process of national renewal. As anybody who knows my work will know that I've got a fixation with the myth of rebirth or palingenesis. And so I only have to see the word renewal or regeneration or born again or whatever. And I think, yeah, friend, not foe. And a totalizing revolution. I prefer totalizing because it takes us into the language or the analysis of very neglected political theorists like Talmon, that very few people have actually heard of in the new generation, but who actually realized way back that totalitarian revolutions in the 20th century were trying to create a new type of democracy using the arts and social engineering to do so. And they all went horribly wrong, but we must never forget that most bad marriages start off as passionate love affairs. Secondly, it confirms my basic argument in Modernism and Fascism that the Marxist school of theory, which follows Walter Benjamin in polarizing communist and fascist aesthetics in terms of politicization of the aesthetic and aestheticization of the political, is simply wrong. That binary opposition between those two regimes I find simple-minded, though obviously I can't judge a genius as I think he was, like Benjamin, especially given the circumstances in which he was writing. He didn't have the luxury of being in Oxford or Harvard or La Sapienza to think about these things. Not only did Stalinist and Maoist aesthetics extensively aestheticize and euphemize the political in the dirtiest sense of the word, but fascism systematically, that should say, that's interesting, anesthetized, it aestheticized the political. To cite my Modernism of Fascism, Emilio Gentile stresses how important it is to avoid letting emphasis on the aestheticization of politics lead to a kind of aestheticization of fascism itself, privileging only its literary, aesthetic and symbolic aspects while losing sight of motivations and matrices that are essentially political in nature. For him, such an approach risks, quote, trivializing the fundamentally political nature of fascism, its culture, its ideology, and its symbolic universe, to a point where, quote, it obscures fascism's other important feature, its politicization of aesthetics. And I think if you read Patricia's excellent book in the light of that statement, especially with that one word, though there is an interesting link etymologically and psychologically between the aestheticization and anesthetization. If you think of the role of pane and circenses, bread and circuses in, yeah, okay, right. So next one, I'm getting pairs of two fingers now. It associates fascist theatrical aesthetics refreshingly with the fascist myth of homo, and I would also say mulier fascistus, who will come forth from the fascist revolution in what Emilio, not the Giovanni Gentili, terms fascism's anthropological revolution. It thus endorses the fact that fascism promoted what I termed, in an article that's not cited, that's a nasty dig at your lack of literacy about Griffin, the primacy of culture, not only over economics, as Tim Mason recognized in the analysis of Nazism, but of politics in favor of culture. In other words, the primacy of culture meant that culture really was the central engine of the fascist revolution. And I'll summarize this. Basically, I'm really pleased. I wrote this year the introduction to the new edition of Moss's The Fascist Revolution. I felt honored by that. We're all dwarfs standing on the shoulders of giants. I am utterly derivative in my realization about the centrality of rebirth as a myth, but I do think Mosse massively neglected, especially as a prophet in his homeland, Germany, massively neglected this brilliant guy who went from medieval studies to recognizing the power of ideas in shaping culture, then into a fascination with Nazism. And he wrote a book in 1966 called Nazi Culture, you know. And so this recognition of centrality of culture is really extraordinary. And it really, again, emphasizes what a nincompoop Bosworth is in thinking that it's all, any talk about art under fascism is all because we've been reading French post-structuralists. And finally, the recognition of the cogency of placing cultural and anthropological renewal, or what Mosse describes as the capturing of the utopian dreams and hopes for a new order of so much of the population, at the heart of the fascist revolution, as first proposed, is consistent with Marla Stone's theory of hegemonic pluralism in the patron state, that Mussolini's regime created a socio-cultural habitat where all cultural production, no matter how apparently apolitical, became linked by association with fascism and was experienced by many as the manifestation of a national renewal, yeah, okay, or renaissance, in which high art was no longer peripheral to society, let alone the product of individual artistic genius, to be appreciated solely by the educated classes of the bourgeoisie, but at the heart of a national consciousness and available to and appreciated by il popolo. Finally, it's deeply congruent with the work of Eleftheria Ioannidou about the way the re-performance of classical and especially Roman theatre was meant to make the past present, representation in a way which is nothing to do with bourgeois scopophilia, watching art. It's about making the past present again, and it also ties in with some of my distinctions in the book. And in short, I welcome the book. I think it shows that there has been a marvelous transformation out of really quite extraordinarily offbeat analysis of fascism in the past. I wish more Italians could understand their own past, because I find extraordinary pockets of ignorance amongst Italians about their past, largely because of the Italian educational system. My wife, who was Italian, had fascism in her textbook, but never got to it because it was never taught. And basically, I think this is a wonderful book to add to the shelf of exciting new literature and new secondary works. And I hope it will soon be translated into Italian, where it can be properly appreciated. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Roger. That's great. I want to apologize right away. There is actually somebody using a leaf blower outside. If there's a terrible noise, I apologize. So Patricia, one thing before it is your turn. First of all, Roger's going to work on not sharing his screen anymore.
Stop sharing.
Great. Thank you. You have actually mastered Zoom, Roger.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I'm a Zoomist.
You are. So Patricia, I'm not going to attempt to wrap up what anybody else said, but I want to just insert this last point about my remarks as part of our questions for you, to stage our questions for you. One of the ways I would describe your book upon first reading is to say that it actually answers questions that historians, cultural historians, but historians, and other people, social scientists, I mean, some historians think they're social scientists and some don't, so we'll leave that aside, but sociologists, historical anthropologists, and so on, have their questions. And you have addressed these questions, but in this different way. And I think that is how I would, at first blush, kind of encapsulate it, maybe for my students, right, is to say, well, we have to think in terms of what can you answer with what materials. And so that's something if you have time and interest, I would love to hear any commentary on that. Anyway, it is your turn.
Okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me well? I hope. Okay. Where to begin? First of all, of course, really briefly, the thank you to Cambridge, to Emma, who was behind the scenes organizing this whole event, and to Emily, who was my editor on this book and steered it through in a not very easy year to go through production. I'd also like to really briefly mention Kate Brett, who was my initial contact at Cambridge and editor for the book, who my initial proposal was for a book that was mammoth in terms of its dimensions, which wasn't going to be possible. And Kate in particular was really active and insightful in that discussion in terms of thinking how to reshape the book, and probably what book will come next. But we'll talk about that another day. And Mia, Roger, and Jeffrey, it's an honor actually to have you here to discuss the book. And I think I don't need to say more than that. Thank you for these really wonderful observations and questions. I think I will begin with Mia's last kind of wrap-up question, comment, which also speaks very much to Jeffrey's initial observations about historiography and this sort of problematic place of the theater in histories of fascism and fascist culture. You know, it's been about 30 or 40 years where there's been really fantastic progress, even just the very fact that we should be looking at the culture of fascism, and whether that's fine arts, whether it's architecture, whether it's literature. Cinema, of course, for the reasons Jeffrey mentioned, has gotten a lot of attention. And the theater, despite the fact that they're so close in some ways, I always found didn't. And here, for those who are listening who don't know me, I should probably mention that I come to this period and Italian fascism and the theater as a theater historian. My training is actually in theater, not in Italian studies. And so that lack would, of course, be obvious to me initially. I, sort of had my first introduction, I think, as is true for everyone who comes from theater to this period, is Pirandello. And but also in a sense of the introduction, but you sort of have this idea that he's the only thing that existed. He was the only thing that was interesting. And by the way, that was despite fascism. That was, kind of the initial presentation that didn't quite ring true to me. in part because shortly after I had studied the period a little bit, I discovered Bontempelli, and I'll get to Bontempelli, as that was one of Jeffrey's questions. And so initially my research was it was driven by a desire to pay attention to theater like the other arts were being paid attention to. Feeling that there was this lack of looking at the theater during fascism. But I think as my research went on, it became very clear to me, though, that theater wasn't the ends of my research. I was interested in the theater as an art form because that's what I study, and it's also what I do. But it became really clear to me that the theater of that period was important because it tells us something about fascism itself. And so I certainly wanted to fill a gap in terms of we need to understand more about the theater, at least as much as we understand about the other arts. But increasingly, it became very clear to me that the theater helps us ask questions that other arts don't help us ask. The Benjamin problem of aestheticization of politics versus politicization of aesthetics, I think, is a key one there, right? Theater theater people, I mean, I say this, in these words in the book, are pretty specifically equipped to deal with this question. But for a long time hadn't wanted to deal with it. And that's just one example of an area where I thought that the specificity of the arts is something that we shouldn't forget, because each one of them helps us to pose different questions. And so certainly that was one of the things that that happened with this book, and that I hoped would happen with the book, and did. So that's good. I'm glad that was perceived. I almost don't know what to tackle first, because
we can move to a question if you'd like.
Are there a lot of questions?
No, there's one question.
Okay.
Question.
Let me
Go right ahead.
Let's see here. I think what one of the questions that Mia, actually, that you posed, one of your observations, I think, is really important and really interesting to me. This sort of thinking about the representations. Mia talked about this problem that theater artists weren't allowed to represent Mussolini on stage. This was substantially a censorship rule, right? That the character of Mussolini could not appear. There were exceptions made, but they always had to be specifically approved. And I think this is a really paradoxical thing, because so much of fascism and its consensus, if we decide to use that term and talk about it, and its appeal clearly lied in the figure of Mussolini. So it was a natural instinct to want to pay that attention to him, and but became problematic, and it became problematic for very many reasons. And I think with the theater in particular, there was a sense in the censorship office that theatrical representation can only be controlled up to a certain extent, right? It's too unpredictable. So even if we have the script and we know what the script says, things can get out of hand. And so I think this is one of the reasons that the representation was so problematic. probably what's interesting about that is Mussolini finds his own strategy, right? When I talk about the Forzano plays that that Jeffrey mentioned in particular, Mussolini collaborated with Forzano, who was an opera librettist and a very successful playwright, on historical tragedies where we have Caesar, Napoleon, and Cavour, who basically become proxies for Mussolini himself. And so he turns to historical analogy in many ways, arguably simply to represent himself on stage, right? And so obviously they're in a very controlled situation because he's a shadow author of the play of the plays. That kind of control of the representation, of course, wasn't always so easy to have. But I think one of the things that I find really fascinating, sort of in general, about Mussolini's faith in the possibilities of theatrical representation gets to one of the elements of fascism itself, and in particular some of Mussolini's aesthetic ideas, is that it's much more complicated and almost trans-historical. It is more of that than we think. We have a Mussolini who is very clearly schooled in and a believer in this kind of romantic tradition of the theater. And in the unification period in Italy, the theater, and not just in Italy, but theater is always seen as an important contributor to the nation building process and the building of a national identity. So in some ways, Mussolini's embrace of this is really classic for the theater. On the other hand, there's this whole element of Mussolini's more recent cultural formation that has to do with his relationship to the avant-garde and to the futurists, and this sense of, and even someone like D'Annunzio, who all in very different ways see that it's necessary to collapse the spaces of art and politics. So that's a sort of tradition of the theater that begins to work in really different ways in the modernist period. And these sort of contrasting thrusts, Mussolini plays with them all and works with them all. And that for me is where, thank you too. I see. That for me is where we have terms like pluralism that we really kind of need to think about and unpack, because a stylistic pluralism doesn't mean that there's a lack of coherence, either ideologically or aesthetically thought of in a broader sense rather than just a style, right? And Bontempelli, I would like actually to respond to that question by Jeffrey about Bontempelli. Bontempelli was really my first love of Italian literature. I actually learned to read Italian because I discovered Bontempelli, and essentially nothing was translated in English at the time. And Bontempelli plays less of a role in this book, in part because two reasons. One, because I felt like I had given him a lot of attention elsewhere. And I wanted to underscore how important that he was, but I also wanted to, sort of round out the picture that I was providing, but also for a really specific reason, is that Mussolini spoke really specifically. He spoke a lot about Bontempelli, but he spoke more about his narrative works than he did about his theater. And so when I sort of had to, make decisions about where I was going, that was one of them. I go back to Bontempelli time and time again. And I think if anything, one of the things I do really feel that Bontempelli was a revolutionary at his core, and he would, and he jumped with full force into every movement or belief that he had. I think over time, and this is partly for working on this book, partially just rereading other things, is sometimes I have a sense that he was even really more fascist than I thought he was in the beginning. That I think is a little bit of a shift, which, you know, doesn't make me entirely happy, but that is there. There are a lot of other things to respond to, but maybe we should get to the question.
We have a lot of questions now.
Exactly,
They've been flowing in. So
Great.
I think the best thing to do is for me to read them out loud.
Okay.
You?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So our first one is from Claudio Fogu. Hello, Claudio.
Hi, Claudia.
He says, unfortunately, he hasn't had a chance to read the book yet, which I think is okay because it's been out for 10 minutes. Okay, I'm wondering if Mussolini's attachment to theater in terms of his own authorship of support as cultural artifact or as a privileged site of conjunction between aesthetics and politics. Oh my goodness, the question just disappeared. Oh, there it is. Oh, that was strange. Wait, I'm so sorry. I've never done before, so I don't know where.
It's under-answered, Mia.
But I don't see it. Oh, there it is. Thank you. Thank you. Now I see it. Oh, that's so disturbing. Okay. I'm wondering if Mussolini's attachment to theater developed or waned over time. And if so, if it had anything to do with his well-known disappointment with cinema, quote, the most powerful weapon. Sorry about that, everyone. Learning.
Oh, quite all right. Thank you, Claudio. I wouldn't say that his attachment diminished over time. He did grow increasingly frustrated with the theater. But what's interesting there is the response was to keep working harder and to intensify the initiatives, broaden the initiatives, and even, this is one of the things that's really interesting to me, be persuaded more by the possibility of propaganda theater. For the first 15 years or so, there was a pretty blanket anti-propaganda response, or at least very obviously propaganda. Obviously, propagandistic works did not appeal to Mussolini at all. He referred to them as fascist chronicles, right? And said, that's not what I want. That's not what I'm asking you for. He starts to give more space to the overtly propagandistic, and Forzano in particular is an excellent, terrible example of that. And this is already in the late 30s, and this is, and this is a moment where they're not so secure that their endeavors are working, and so there's a little bit of a clenching of teeth. I see that. This is something that Ruth Ben-Ghiat has talked about in cinema in part, and the sort of the move toward empire in her book Empire Cinema, and sort of how do we do narrative cinema, not just documentary cinema, and there's something similar happening in the theater where we're opening up more and more and more to that sort of propagandistic expression, the stuff that I call in the book the ugly of fascist theater, so alongside the good and the bad.
Okay, so we have ample number of questions, but so several of them are, of course, from people who appear in one way or another in your book. You've dedicated your book to Ed Muir. Ed Muir has a question. I think I should take his question. He says, perhaps I ask this question because I'm teaching Jesuit theater today, but I wonder if there's a deep cultural sense of the politics of theater in Italy that is especially pronounced, that makes Mussolini less modern, but more of a traditionalist in the Italian sense, an exponent of what might be called deep Catholicism, a culture that is not explicitly theological, but a form of creating a presence on the stage, as Loyola imagined.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think of course, Emilio Gentile's work and the work that Mossi had done as well on the nationalization of the masses, but also this sense of the sacralization of politics sets that context really, really clearly and really well. Some of the things that Roger mentioned earlier speak to this as well. And I think that is absolutely part of what's going on here, and also this sense of the importance of ritual in the theater, and which is theater works as a ritual in ways very similar to the way that mass is a ritual, right? And so, to me, these are sort of all points on a single constellation. And always so much in conflict, in the same way that there's this sort of romantic nationalist tradition in the theater that fuses its way in, but it can't be just that. It has to, sort of take on a modernist spin. And I think we have a similar kind of triangulation going on with that spiritual sense as well. Mm-hmm. I see other.
Interesting. I'm just still thinking about the rite of passage and initiation. Okay, also in your book is Marianne Witt, and she asks a technical sort of question: where did you find Mussolini's plays? Are they published? Are they in manuscript? Was there any attempt to destroy them in the post-fascist period? And have they ever been performed since then? And then she doesn't ask this, but I could add, do you think anyone will perform them?
Oh my goodness. This is a great question, actually, for a very simple reason. The Mussolini collaboration with Forzano, right? We have access to because Forzano was very proud of this collaboration, and so published his own volume of the collection of the plays that he entitled Mussolini Dramatic Author, right? And then, but where he's really the other author there. So that is actually in those plays are actually in an old published version. Were there attempts to destroy them in the post-fascist period? I don't. I don't. It seems like if there were many materials that were destroyed, they that happened actually during the war, and they weren't sort of cover-up attempts. I think one of the things that's the immediate post-fascist period is really complicated in terms also of theater history here, because there's much more continuity in the theatrical institutions than there should have been, because once fascism fell, a lot of personalities should have been removed from their posts in the government, and they weren't. And so there was a lot of kind of collaboration is too strong of a word, but sort of let's set some things aside and just keep moving forward. And that, of course, has its repercussions for the documents we find as well.
Right. So Giorgio Bertolini's here, and he asked what happened to fascist theater post 1945, and I think you've just kind of answered it. And this sort of problem, this situation of fascist cultural producers who continue to be cultural producers, often typically reinvented after the war, is a general one. And then for people who have sent questions in that are actually answered in the book, forgive me, I'm not choosing your questions because sorry, but I do have a question I'm going to read you from Matteo Cavalier Riccardi. Could you speak a bit about the role of theater criticism in the production and reception of theater in the fascist period? Could it be said that the theater, despite being scare quote embodied and scare quote immediate, was also being created in anticipation of and response to the press?
That's a great question. I actually find that theater criticism in the period is much more interesting and much more lively than I would have than I would have expected. I think one of the things that we are conditioned to know is that control of the press was so absolute that, and in fact, this is an argument that has been made. Well, it's hard to really know what any of these plays were like because all of the reviews, were sort of vetted and contained. But there's actually a very robust activity of theater criticism. One of the chief critics, though, however, is Silvio D'amico, who is also has very close and good relationship with the regime. He co-directs with the Director General of Theater, the major magazine, the theater magazine of the period, and then he's writing his criticism in journals or in the newspapers, excuse me, as well. Critics were more outspoken about good or bad than we might think. In terms of sort of leading conditioning criticism itself, sort of speaking to, I wouldn't have a very clear answer on that right now. I mean, certainly all pieces of the process work together, but that's true always today as well, I think.
Okay, so it saddens me not to bring you all the questions. Some of them are great, but we have 4 minutes. And I have 2 questions that are important, but I know you'll have a kind of quick answer to, because
Okay.
they're yes or no, and do I know the answer questions.
Yeah.
So one, I'm going to give them to you at the same time. One of them is from Joseph Farrell, sorry, it's about Pirandello. I would like to hear you talk more about Pirandello's fascism. The question is, was he a fascist? Was he an opportunist? Did he change opinion from year to year? These are important Pirandello questions. And then the other question is from Anna Celenza, who's also in your book. And she asks, do you see any links between Mussolini's interest in theater and his, scare quote, reconstruction initiatives of Rome's ancient archaeological sites and or architecture?
Okay. Very quickly, Pirandello, I would say, Mia knows it is true that my response to this is rather brief. Yes, he was a fascist. Yes, he was an opportunist. He changed his mind from month to month, probably, kind of depending on Pirandello had a lot of his own complications, psychological and otherwise. When he felt like he was being adequately supported, he was pleased and favorable. And when he felt like he wasn't being properly recognized, he was more critical. Consistently, he thought Mussolini was crude, but Pirandello wasn't, a lover of democracy. And so I think, there are certain things there that we would like to imagine problematic for him that really weren't. Anna's question, let me see if I can actually find it, because I can see them too, so I can remind, oh, no, it went away. There was.
Is there a connection with the reconstruction / excavations of Rome, Roman theater, Roman architecture?
Right. Absolutely. And I think they're the two fused, right? One of the major areas of fascist theatrical production happened inside excavated theaters, right? And fixed up ancient theaters. And so there was, this sort of, how do we render modern, even the ancient spaces? There's a lot of really interesting work going on in that aspect of Romanità, right, and the importance of the ancient past in fascism. That's a question that's been really key for Roger as well, and that's a really lively area of exploration. But I'll be quiet because time.
No, well, I'm eager to say this. I just was very pleased to read about the Libyan aspect of this, because it is a key moment, 1937, and this kind of making oratic the ancient theater of Sabrata by this attendance and by the performances. And so first of all, I'm always happy when the colonies are included. And secondly, I'm just particularly happy that you included the entire, I mean, the maps are great, but the spectrum also, because that adds to this kind of nation making, right? The colonial space. Anyway, we are out of time. And I just thank you so much. Thank you, Patricia, for the book. Thank you, Cambridge University, for asking me to do this. It's an honor to do this. Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. I just really think this is a great sort of start off for the book, Patricia, and thank you. And thanks to all who have attended and asked questions, even though not all of them were addressed.
That's right. I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.